When love turns into lies and trust into betrayal, only courage and determination can bring you back to yourself. But what if every pain hides a chance for a new beginning? The sun had just set when I finished my work as a lawyer at a large company. My schedule was incredibly tight, and I often found myself consumed by work until late in the evening, when the rest of the city had already settled into the stillness of the night. This day was no exception. I stretched wearily, easing the tension in my shoulders, then gathered my things and put on my coat. Turning off the office light, I stepped into the darkening evening, feeling the slight chill quickly take over the street as the sun disappeared beyond the horizon. The city was already beginning to drown in lights, and I couldn't help but notice how silently and majestically the tall building where I worked loomed before me. Felix was waiting by the exit. I had first met him in a coffee shop. It was a casual, unremarkable encounter, which later had a profound impact on me. I had mistakenly taken his coffee, and that was the start of our communication. We laughed about it, and at that moment, although I couldn't admit it to myself, I already felt a strange, almost magnetic attraction. I remember the first thing I noticed about him, his bright blue eyes. They looked at me as if he was genuinely interested in getting to know me better, not just my position or status. There was a sincerity in him I hadn't encountered in other men, and that gaze left a mark on my heart. "Hi, how was your day?" Felix asked, greeting me with his warm, slightly tired smile. "The same as always, work, work, work," I replied, tossing my hair back. He smiled in response. "Well, yes, but you said you were planning to have dinner at that Italian restaurant you mentioned last time." "Sounds like something I definitely need," he said, and I smiled. His words sounded easygoing and casual, as always. As we walked down the street, he began to tell me about his past. The thought of opening his soul to me seemed natural to him. "You know, my previous marriage was tough," Felix said, his voice becoming a little tense as he looked into the distance, as if searching for answers in the dark. "Elma cheated on me, and it broke me. It was terrifying. And no matter how hard I tried to recover, nothing worked. My parents sided with her and stopped talking to me. The only person who was there for me was my sister, Liza." I felt a bit uncomfortable hearing about his pain, but with sympathy, I said, "I'm so sorry, Felix. That must have been really hard." "Yes, it was really difficult," he sighed. "But you know, Liza was there for me. She didn't judge. We've always understood each other, no matter what." "Oh, Liza. I haven't met her yet," I said, trying to shift the conversation to avoid delving deeper into his pain. "No, not yet. But you'll definitely meet her. You'll like her. She has the same sense of humor as me," he said with a grin, and I felt the warmth in his words, which I had been seeking. As our relationship developed day by day, I began to feel my affection for Felix grow. We often met for dinner, walked in the park, went to the movies. He was sincere, kind, and attentive, and his story of betrayal touched my heart. I felt that I wanted to protect him, be there for him, and I promised myself that I would never hurt him. Months passed, and our bond strengthened. We made a decision that would change our lives. We decided to get married. Planning the wedding was a real challenge, especially with my tight work schedule, but Felix was by my side every step of the way. He supported me, organized all the details, and always found time to be with me despite our busy lives. On the day of our wedding, I felt a strange mix of excitement and nervousness. Standing in my wedding dress in front of the mirror, I couldn't help but notice how my perception of life had changed. Felix looked flawless in his suit, standing at the altar, waiting for me. It was so exciting. I walked down the aisle, feeling my heart race with every step. The ceremony went perfectly, but there was one thing that caught my attention. I noticed that there was no one from Felix's family next to him, except for a young woman with a bright smile. It was Liza, his sister. He proudly introduced us. Sandra, meet Liza." She extended her hand with a smile. "Nice to meet you, Sandra. Phyllis has told me so much about you," she said, and I felt how her friendly smile lightened the atmosphere a little. I smiled in return, but despite the joy and excitement that were overtaking me at that moment, part of me was wondering about Phyllis's family. Why weren't they there? Why just Liza? Could there be secrets he hadn't told me yet? But I decided to put these thoughts aside for later. Family is a complicated thing, I told myself, and maybe not everything is as simple as it seems. The weeks after our wedding were a time of complete bliss for us. We enjoyed morning breakfasts on the terrace, cozy dinners by the fireplace, and late-night movie marathons. Everything seemed perfect, but inside me, there was a feeling that something unexpected might appear on the horizon, capable of disrupting this ideal world. Comfort and ease between us grew stronger with each passing day, but everything changed one evening when Felix came home from work. He entered the house with such a look that I immediately understood something was wrong. He seemed troubled, his eyes clouded by heavy thoughts. I looked up from the book I was reading and felt a tightness inside me. He began to speak hesitantly, as if the words were coming hard to him. "Sandra, I need to discuss something," he said, his voice slightly hoarse. I anxiously set the book down on the table and looked at him. "What's wrong?" I asked, my heart suddenly racing, and I could feel my pulse quickening. "It's Liza," he replied, his eyes dulling. "She's going through a really tough time. Her boyfriend was abusive towards her, and she needs a place to stay." My heart tightened. I stared at him in shock, trying to process the words he had just said. It was terrible, frightening. I couldn't believe that something like this could have happened to Liza. "Oh my God. Oh my God, that's awful," I whispered, feeling a hollow emptiness in my chest. "Of course, she can stay with us, are you sure?" I asked, not fully realizing how deeply shaken I was by his words. Felix sighed in relief. "Of course, she's family. We need to help her," he said, though there was a hint of uncertainty in his voice. The next day, Liza moved into our guest room. She looked completely different from the day of our wedding. Bruises were visible on her face and arms, and her gaze was defeated, as though she had lost all hope for a brighter future. She stood in the doorway, and when I met her gaze, something inside me broke. "Hi, Liza," I said, trying to sound optimistic, but inside, my emotions were churning. "I'm so sorry to hear what happened. Please know that you're safe here." She gave a faint smile, but it wasn't as bright as it used to be. Liza was utterly downcast, and I understood that she needed time to recover. "Thank you, Sandra, it means a lot to me," she said quietly, her voice filled with bitterness and exhaustion. A few days passed, and I began to notice that Liza and Felix were spending a lot of time together. They laughed, chatted about their own things, and sometimes even cooked together. It was nice to see them so close. It seemed that the bond between them was so natural and sincere. But sometimes, especially when they were alone, I felt like an outsider. Those moments when I became the third wheel in my own home bothered me. The feeling that I didn't quite fit into their world grew stronger. One evening, after dinner, when I felt I could no longer ignore the rising tension, I decided to talk to Felix. We sat on the couch, and I began cautiously, trying not to hurt his feelings. "I'm glad that Liza is here, and that we can help her," I started, trying not to sound too worried, but, sometimes I feel a bit left out. It seems like there's such a close connection between you two, and I'm not sure how I fit into that. Felix looked at me with mild surprise. He clearly hadn't expected to hear anything like this, but his reaction was gentle. He gently pulled me closer. "I understand what you're saying," he said after a while. "Liza and I have been through a lot over the years. We've supported each other, and she means a lot to me. But I promise I'll do everything I can so you don't feel that way." You're important to me, Sandra. I nodded, not entirely convinced but appreciating his words. It was important to me that he heard my feelings, and now I could hope that everything would get better. The next day, Phyllis planned a movie night for the three of us. It was our way of returning to some semblance of normalcy, of trying to spend time together as we used to, with smiles and light laughter. We settled on the couch, enjoying popcorn and watching an old movie we had once loved. Liza shared stories about her childhood, and I felt like I was gradually becoming a part of their world. I was glad she was sharing her memories with me, but still, deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, that something in this situation was off. I began to notice how they whispered to each other when they thought I couldn't hear. And sometimes, when I entered a room, their conversations would stop, and the silence in the air would make it seem like they were hiding something. I tried not to pay attention to it, convincing myself that it was just the closeness between a brother and a sister. But something whispered to me that it wasn't just that. Something wasn't right. One evening, I decided to talk to Liza. We were sitting in the garden, and I, gathering my courage, approached her. "Liza, can we talk?" I asked, trying not to sound accusing. She flinched slightly but immediately agreed. "Of course, what's going on?" "I've noticed that you and Phyllis share a very close bond, and that's great," I began, but then I fell silent. "But sometimes it feels like you two have some shared secrets. I'm not a part of them. Maybe it's just my imagination, but it makes me feel a little uncomfortable." Liza sighed and looked at me with understanding. "Sandra, I understand what you're saying. But you need to know. Phyllis and I have been through a lot together. It doesn't mean we're hiding anything from you. Sometimes, we talk about things from the past that can be painful." I nodded, a little reassured by her words, though still not entirely convinced. But I appreciated her honesty and sincerity. "Thank you for understanding, Liza," I said. I just wanted to clear the air. The following months were a real test for me. Work consumed me entirely. I was buried in paperwork, reports, and projects that had to be completed late into the night. Time flew by, and I could feel the dynamics between Phyllis, Liza, and me starting to shift. When I finally came home, tired and worn out, they, on the other hand, were spending time together. I noticed how their bond grew stronger each day. They laughed, shared memories, cooked dinners, and sometimes I felt like I was becoming a stranger in my own home. It was hard to explain, but I began to sense that an unusual connection had formed between them that I couldn't fully grasp. Every interaction, every glance, every smile between them left me in the dark. In the moments when I wasn't around and Phyllis and Liza were alone, I felt an invisible wall rising between them. I tried to ignore this feeling, but it wouldn't let go. One day, during a short break at work, I couldn't hold it in anymore and shared my concerns with a colleague, Sarah. Holding a cup of coffee in my hands, I confessed. "I don't know, Sarah, I just can't shake this feeling. Everything seems different, not like it used to be. I should be helping Liza, but something doesn't feel right." Sarah looked at me with concern and leaned in, lowering her voice. "Are you talking about Liza? Has something happened?" I sighed heavily. "She's been living with us for a few months now, and while I try to be a good host and support her, I constantly feel like something is off. I can't explain it." Sarah paused, setting her laptop aside. "Have you talked to Phyllis about this?" I nodded. "Yes, but he said I'm reading too much into little things." Sarah thought for a moment and then, lowering her voice, suggested, "If you really want to get to the bottom of this, I can talk to a friend of mine at the police. He works in a department that handles such cases. Maybe Liza has reported the abuse, and you don't know about it." Her suggestion was tempting. I thought it over, but couldn't stop worrying about the consequences. I didn't want to break Liza's trust, didn't want to cause harm. Do you think it's a good idea? I asked, concerned. Sarah shrugged. It's for your peace of mind, Sandra. If there's a record, you'll be able to relax. If not, then you can be sure that you're overthinking things. It's up to you what you want. I hesitated, but in the end, I agreed. A few days later, Sarah came back with the results. My doubts were confirmed when she said, Sandra, there are no records of Liza reporting any abuse. I double-checked the information with my friend. There's nothing. My heart sank. I didn't want to believe that Liza might have been hiding something from us, but at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Are you sure? I asked, struggling to hide my confusion. Sarah nodded, her expression serious. Yes. My friend checked, so don't worry. You can relax. I thanked her, but inside, I wasn't at all calm. That evening, when I got home, I decided to talk to Liza. I felt like I needed to clarify things, to relieve the pressure in my chest. At dinner, when we were all gathered around the table, I tried to casually bring up the subject. Liza was in a good mood, so I decided to start the conversation gently. You know, Liza, I have a friend who works with victims of domestic violence. She said she could help if you want to get advice or even legal assistance. It could be a useful step if you decide to move forward. Liza immediately stiffened, her face became less expressive, and she stopped smiling. I felt the conversation taking on a tense tone. That's very considerate of you, Sandra, she said quietly. But I'd prefer to leave it behind. I want to move on, to leave all of this in the past. I tried to insist, unwilling to let go of the subject that troubled me so much. I understand, but it's important to report these things, Liza. It's not just about your safety, but also about the safety of others. I want you to be safe, to be able to live peacefully. Liza looked upset. Her eyes flashed, and she clenched her fists as she sat on the edge of the chair. I know, but it was my choice. She barely held back her emotions. I don't want to go back to it. Not now. The conversation ended there. I felt a tightness in my chest. We all sat in silence. I don't know why, but at that moment, I realized something was wrong. Something I couldn't yet understand, but something I needed to figure out. I pretended to go on a business trip, but in reality, I decided to observe them to understand what was happening in my own home. I needed to know. It was the only thing that could calm me down. I couldn't stay in the dark anymore, listening to their quiet conversations, seeing them smile at each other, and not feeling that there was something hidden between them, something more than just friendship. I told Phyllis and Liza about my upcoming trip to Chicago. Their reaction was almost identical, genuine surprise, but I noticed something more in Phyllis's eyes that I couldn't explain. He was happy. That was obvious. The question, "How long will you be gone?" didn't just sound interested, but there was an almost restrained joy in his voice. I tried not to pay attention to it, answering casually. Just a couple of days, I said, trying to hide the worry in my voice. Important meeting, I need to be there. Liza, as always, intervened gently, with a smile that didn't reach my heart. We'll miss you, but work is work. Take care of yourself. Her words sounded sincere, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something unspoken in them, something invisible that slipped past my attention. The next morning, I packed my suitcase, everything carefully arranged so as not to arouse suspicion. I went to the airport, but instead of boarding the plane, I rented a car and checked into a motel near our home. I spent the entire day watching them, shopping, and planning my unexpected visit home in the evening. I parked the rental car a block away from our house and, cautiously approaching, entered through the back door. The door wasn't locked, and I quietly walked into the bedroom, holding my breath to avoid making any noise. But what I saw made me freeze. Phyllis and Liza were lying in our bed, holding each other. Their bodies were pressed tightly together, and it was so intimate that I couldn't believe my eyes. My legs gave out, and I barely managed to stop myself from screaming. Betrayal pierced me like an icy knife. I stood there, unable to comprehend what was happening. When I finally spoke, my voice sounded like a roar in an empty space. "It's your own sister." I couldn't hold back the anger that was boiling inside me. They both jumped. Panic was obvious on their faces. Felix quickly jumped out of bed, his eyes full of fear. "Sandra, it's not what it looks like." His voice was nervous, and he stepped toward me. I smirked, though tears filled my eyes. "It looks like you're in bed with your sister," I said, pressing my lips together. Liza, frantically trying to cover herself with the blanket, could only squeeze out, "Sandra, let us explain." I stepped closer to them, feeling the bitterness rise in my chest. How could they explain what I saw? How could they justify this? Explain? I couldn't control my fury. "How can you explain this?" Felix, clearly embarrassed, took a deep breath, avoiding my gaze as he said, "Liza is not my sister. We met at university, and—" His words hung in the air. I replayed all the events in my head, their mysterious glances, secretive conversations, the photos from the past. And suddenly, everything made sense. I didn't need to say anything more. I looked at both of them, and now every word they said seemed like a lie. "So all this time, you were lying to me?" I whispered, trying to grasp the full scale of the deception. You lied to me about everything." Finally, Liza spoke, her voice trembling, but she still took responsibility. "We didn't plan for it to go this far. When you were so kind and generous to me, we just couldn't stop." I looked at Felix, searching his gaze for any hint of remorse. "Why, Felix? Why did you marry me if you loved her?" I could barely hide the tears. He lowered his gaze, and his silence was more terrifying to me than any words. The guilt was evident in his eyes. He said, "I thought I could escape from her, that you were everything I ever wanted." But old feelings resurfaced. At that moment, when I was standing before them, there was no place left for words. I felt my heart heavy, constricting with betrayal. I turned and left, not looking back. I couldn't look at them. I couldn't be in that house, surrounded by those lies. The next morning, I sat in Palmyra's office, my good friend and colleague lawyer. She had always been my support, and I knew I could trust her in any situation. Palmyra listened to me attentively, her face a mixture of concern and anger. "Sandra, this is just unbelievable," she said, her indignation clear. "How could they do this to you?" "I was a fool," I muttered, looking down at the floor. "I trusted him, I believed him." Palmyra leaned forward, taking my hands in hers. "It's not your fault. He's the one who lied." Her voice was firm and confident. I took a deep breath and finally spoke. "I want to take this to court, Palmyra. I need them to pay for what they've done." Palmyra's eyes narrowed, and she nodded, full of determination. "You have every right, Sandra. We will do everything to make sure they are held accountable." In the following weeks, we built the strongest possible case. Palmyra and I studied the laws regarding fraud and deception in marriage. I was determined to ensure that Felix would face the consequences of his actions. One evening, Palmyra called me with news. "Sandra, I've managed to get in touch with Felix's ex-wife. She's willing to help." A sense of relief and gratitude washed over us. "Thank you, Palmyra. This could be the key we need." A few days later, Felix's ex-wife, Alma, came to see me. She was a petite woman with a steely resolve in her eyes. "Sandra," she began, extending her hand. "I'm so sorry you're going through this." Phyllis has a history of deceit, and I experienced it firsthand. I nodded and sat across from her, waiting for her to continue. We were in love, or at least I thought we were. Her voice trembled, but she continued. But then I found out about his affair with Liza. When I confronted him, he portrayed me as the villain and told everyone I was the one cheating. Tears shimmered in Elma's eyes, and as I gently squeezed her hand, I felt how her words cut through me. We need to be sure he won't hurt anyone else. A resolute look flashed across her face. I nodded silently. Now we had more evidence than ever: text messages, photographs. We could use all this in court. Our strategy was becoming clearer. With Elma's testimony and my own, we had a solid case against Phyllis. During the midst of our planning, Palmyra received an unexpected call. "Sandra," she said, her face pale, "it's Phyllis's parents. They want to meet with you tomorrow." I found myself face to face with two elderly people. Their faces were lined with wrinkles from age and sorrow. "We're so sorry," Mrs. Clark began, and her husband continued in a trembling voice. "We tried to warn you, but we didn't know how." Palmyra's mother was holding back tears. "We disowned Phyllis after what he did to Elma, but we never thought he'd do something like this again." Their words only strengthened my resolve. "We'll take this to court," I replied firmly. "He won't be able to hurt anyone else." And then the day of the trial arrived. My heart raced as I walked into the building. Palmyra was right by my side. The courtroom was packed, a sign of the seriousness of the case and the scandal it had caused. When I sat down, I noticed Phyllis and Liza sitting across from me. They were pressed close together, whispering. Phyllis looked in my direction, and guilt flashed in his eyes, but he quickly averted his gaze. Palmyra leaned toward me and whispered, "Stay strong, Sandra, we'll get through this." Before I could respond, the judge entered the room, and everyone fell silent. The trial began. With her opening statements, Palmyra convincingly laid out our case, revealing the web of deceit spun by Phyllis and Liza. Their lawyer attempted to paint it as a simple misunderstanding, but the skepticism in the room was palpable. Everyone knew this was far from an innocent mix-up. It was a carefully planned and cruel deception. Palmyra skillfully exposed every step Phyllis and Liza took, shining a spotlight on them that made them grow increasingly nervous. With each new piece of evidence, with every new detail, their lie became more and more apparent. Phyllis's gaze was empty, as though he were trying to hide behind a mask of indifference, but his expressions betrayed his true state. He avoided meeting my eyes, as though my gaze were a tool of justice that could destroy him. Liza, on the other hand, sat upright, her lips pressed into a thin line, and her face wore a frozen mask of pain, but in her eyes, it seemed to me, there was fear. I watched them, but at some point, I felt my stomach tighten. It wasn't relief, it was something else, heavy and threatening. I suppressed my emotions, absorbing all the pain they had caused me. My pain had now become my weapon, and I wouldn't let it fade until I saw their downfall. When Palmyra finished her opening statement, the judge called on Phyllis's lawyer. His attorney, a middle-aged man with a clean-shaven face and a flawless suit, stood and began his speech, trying to present Phyllis as a victim who simply had bad luck in relationships. He described their affair with Liza as an unusual and complicated love story that supposedly got out of hand by accident. The real turning point came when Elma took the stand, speaking calmly and clearly as she recounted the betrayal she had faced at the hands of Phyllis. Her words were simple, but they carried such weight that every sentence struck the hearts of those listening. "I loved him," she said, her voice trembling slightly, but then she straightened up as if ordering herself not to let her emotions overshadow the truth. "He took everything from me. My reputation, my self-esteem. I trusted him. And he destroyed everything that was precious to me." With every word, Elma seemed more determined. She shared the evidence she had kept, text messages, photographs, and even a letter from Felix in which he admitted to his lies. It wasn't just a letter, it was a revelation that called into question all his statements. Felix's lawyer tried to discredit Elma, suggesting that she was bitter and seeking revenge. He claimed her actions were motivated by pain and that she was out for retribution. But Elma's dignity and the evidence she presented spoke for themselves. There was no doubt in the courtroom that her words were backed by facts. After Elma finished her testimony, it was my turn. I stood, feeling the tension constricting my chest, and all eyes turned toward me. I told the court about my relationship with Felix, our turbulent romance, and the heartbreaking betrayal I felt when I learned the truth. I described how I had opened my home and my heart to this man, only to be met with deceit in return. I thought we were building a future together, I said, my voice wavering slightly, but I kept it under control. But all I got was lies and manipulation. He destroyed my faith in people. The room fell silent. I knew these weren't just words. This was my life, shattered by the hands of someone who had seemed like my ideal. I felt a fire ignite within me, and with each word, I knew I had to continue, no matter the pain. Then Liza was called to the stand. She seemed nervous, stumbling over her words as Palmyra asked her questions about their relationship. I couldn't hide the disgust I felt toward her. She admitted that yes, Felix and I had been in a relationship for many years. But she tried to justify her actions, saying they never meant to hurt anyone. But then why lie about us being brother and sister? Palmyra pressed. Why weave such a complex web of lies? Liza looked down, and tears shimmered in her eyes. She pressed her lips together and barely managed to say, "I love him. I was willing to do anything for him. But now I realize what we did was wrong." Her words didn't stir any regret or forgiveness in my heart. I knew her feelings were superficial. She was just afraid of the consequences, but even that didn't excuse her actions. Finally, it was Felix's turn to testify. He looked defeated, a stark contrast to the confident man I once knew. It was like looking at an empty shell. His face lacked any sincerity that could have earned him even a shred of respect. "Why did you do it?" Palmyra asked, her voice soft yet sharp, like the edge of a knife. Felix sighed, and I noticed his shoulders slump, as if the weight of his own guilt was too much for him to bear. "I thought I could have it all," he said, his voice dull, as if he were talking about an abstract choice, not his life. Sandra's love, her home, her companionship. Liza. I never thought it would end up like this. His confessions didn't bring any relief. It wasn't repentance, it was simply the acknowledgement that his desires hadn't turned out the way he expected. His lies, his manipulations were too deep for even the simplest words to restore any lost meaning. The cross-examination was tense, but Felix's confessions left his defense no room to maneuver. He couldn't justify his actions, and it was clear to everyone in the courtroom. He was guilty, and all he had left was to watch as his world crumbled. The closing arguments were impassioned. Palmyra convincingly demonstrated the pain and suffering caused by my actions and the ones I had endured. Felix's lawyer tried to argue that no real harm had been done, but the jury didn't believe it. The trial concluded, and the jury retired to deliberate. I felt a mix of relief and anxiety. Had I done everything I could? Was it enough to put things right? Now, everything was in the hands of the jury. The hours felt like days, but eventually, the jury returned with their verdict. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. 4 people stood. "We find the defendants, Felix and Liza, guilty of fraud and intentional infliction of emotional distress." After the trial, the media attention was overwhelming. Reporters crowded around, demanding interviews, and people I barely knew approached with messages of support. But I was tired of all of it. I didn't want to be in the spotlight. I wanted to move on, start a new life, forget everything that had been tied to them. One evening, Palmyra and I sat on the porch, sipping tea and discussing the events that had passed. Palmyra looked at me with a concerned expression. I know you want to move on, but you can't just suppress everything that's happened. You need to rethink it. I looked into the distance, feeling the tension begin to ease. But at the same time, there was still a weight in my chest. I know, Palmyra, I replied softly. But every time I think about Phyllis and Liza, I feel this burning anger. I want to forget them and everything connected to them. She sighed, as if she knew it wasn't that simple. It's natural, she said. But running away from it won't help. Maybe you should consider therapy. It could help you deal with these emotions. I nodded, considering her words. I'll think about it. I'll try in a few days. Palmyra didn't press me. She just looked at me with understanding, as someone who knows not all problems are solved immediately. And I knew that time was the only healer that could help me. I met Dr. Carter, a well-known therapist, during our first session. My gaze, which seemed to have never met a world without fear and pain, was finally able to drift over her face, trying to find comfort in her kind and sincere words. I told my story, and she patiently listened, never interrupting or judging. When I finished, she said slowly, Sandra, you've experienced a traumatic event. It's normal to feel anger, sadness, or any other emotion. But remember, healing takes time. I nodded, but inside me, there remained a stone that didn't allow me to immediately feel relief. In the following weeks, I slowly immersed myself in therapy. It gave me the keys to understand and accept my feelings, opening up new horizons of understanding. I learned that healing isn't just about forgetting. It's about learning to live with the memories without letting them control me. And though the path was rocky, I began to see a light at the end of the tunnel. One day, after a particularly intense session, Dr. Carter said, Sandra, you've made significant progress. But have you ever thought about what comes next for you? I paused, and in my chest, it felt as though something snapped. My heart responded with anxiety when I thought about the future, about how it might look without the shadow of the past, about what lay ahead. I exhaled before answering. I want to rebuild my life, maybe even find love again. But the thought of trusting someone scares me. Dr. Carter smiled gently, as always calm and confident. It's natural to feel that way. But remember, not everyone is like Phyllis. When you're ready, you will find someone who will value and respect you for who you are. Her words didn't comfort me at that moment, but they stayed with me, like a quiet wave that slowly fills the space and drives out the darkness. Months passed, and immersed in work, I gradually regained my self-confidence. I took on difficult cases, fighting for justice. My reputation as a determined lawyer grew. I became more confident, and my life, like my career, began to stabilize. However, the heart that had once been shattered didn't heal so quickly. But with each day, it became stronger. I was learning to be okay with myself. One evening, working late in the office, I heard a knock on the door. I looked up and saw Mark, a fellow lawyer with whom I had worked on several cases. He stood in the doorway with a cup of coffee in his hand, smiling as though in his world there were no pain or fear. Hey! Sandra's working late again, he said with a warm smile, and I couldn't help but smile back. You know I'm always chasing deadlines, Mark, I replied. He smirked. Want to grab a coffee? Take a break? I hesitated for a moment, but then, thinking it over, I agreed. Sure, let's do that. A coffee break. Mark and I chatted about everything under the sun, work, life, and my ordeal with Phyllis. He listened attentively, and I could feel his genuine support. It was so important. Mark understood me without needing many words or judgments. He was someone I could simply be with, without hiding any part of myself. You're incredibly strong, Sandra. Not many people could come out of a situation like this with such resilience, he told me during one of our conversations, and I felt the weight that had been compressing my heart all this time loosen just a little. As the days went by, we spent more time together, having lunch, attending events, and even going hiking on weekends. It was nice to be around someone who understood me, who didn't judge my past. All of this gave me new strength. And while thoughts of Felix still lingered in my mind, I no longer let them control my life. One evening, as we sat on the beach watching the sunset, Mark turned to me and said, "Sandra, I really enjoy spending time with you. I know you've been through a lot, and I won't rush you, but I want you to know that I care about you." I looked into his eyes, filled with sincerity and warmth. It was that moment when my heart, so used to pain, suddenly felt light, as if, for the first time in a long while, hope had settled in its place. "Thank you, Mark. I really appreciate that. I'm still healing, but it feels so good to have someone like you by my side." Mark smiled and took my hand. That moment was filled with something more than just words. It was a moment of true presence, sincerity, and mutual understanding. We would take it one day at a time, and maybe, over time, days would turn into weeks, and weeks into months. And who knows what the future would bring. But one thing was clear: with him, I was ready to move forward. Life had given me another chance at love, and I wasn't going to let my past hold me back.